My name is Marcel Wahba. I'm the president here of the Arab Gulf States Institute. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's program on financing terrorism. Of the many aspects of the fight against terrorism, cutting off the financial flow is the most critical. It is the oxygen that keeps these groups alive and allows them to recruit, control territory, plan, and carry out violent operations on a global level. The issue of terrorist financing also, obviously, is at the center of the current crisis in the GCC, and it remains the top priority for the U.S. as we seek to defeat Islamic State and other terrorist groups. The U.S. and its Gulf Arab partners have taken significant steps to stem the flow of funds to terrorist groups over the past 15 years. Really a very robust effort since 9/11. However, despite the various measures and regulations put in place, terrorist organizations continue to generate income from the region to finance their activities. What more can be done regionally and globally to stem the flow of money to violent extremists? We have a very distinguished panel with us today to answer that question and explore all the issues related to it. I'm pleased to welcome our guest speakers, Juan Zarate, David Cohen, and Kate Bauer, as well as our very own Executive Vice President, Ambassador Steve Seche, who will introduce the panel and also moderate today's program. Again, welcome and look forward to a good discussion today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcel, and good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I am very pleased to be able to moderate this discussion, and I'm very, very happy to have such distinguished colleagues with me to help enlighten us on this subject, as Marcel said, one of critical interest and one of a very timely nature at the moment, given events in the region and here in Washington as well. My introductions will be short. You can look for greater detail in these handy little programs that were on your chair when you walked in. But allow me to please just briefly introduce Kate Bauer, who's the Blumenstein Katz Family Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a former Treasury official who served as the department's financial attaché in Jerusalem and in the Gulf region. To her right is David Cohen, the former Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and better known to me in his role at Treasury before he joined the CIA, when he was Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And to David's right is Juan Zarate, the Chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network, and I knew Juan for some time when he worked as a Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism from 2005 to 2009. Again, further details available here, but for the sake of time at our disposal, we'll get on with the conversation. And what I'd like to be able to do, perhaps, is give each of our guests a chance to look at what the issue, maybe in a larger sense or larger framing sense, may be here. And I'll ask them a question. They can all respond to it and focus on whatever issues, whatever angles they see as most productive in our conversation. I'm hoping that we can get at this from a bunch of different angles and really then develop a more full picture of what we see out in the Gulf. So my question for you, and I'll start with, are we going to do this in reverse alphabetical order? We decided to give Juan Zarate a chance to go first, which he never got when he was in grade school. So the question is, what is the extent of U.S. counterterrorism and counter-terrorist financing cooperation with the Arab Gulf states, collectively, bilaterally, and is the cooperation now at risk because of the deep fissures we see developing among the GCC states at the moment?
Steve, thank you very much. I want to thank you and Marcel and the Arab Gulf States Institute for the invitation to be here. I count myself as incredibly fortunate to have learned and been in government when you both were serving, and to have learned at your feet was a great honor, and to have learned with David and Kate as well. So I'm really privileged to be here. I'm probably the least of the experts here, but I'm happy to contribute as I can. I think there's been a kind of a natural evolution to the counter-terrorist financing, counterterrorism cooperation between the U.S. and our Gulf allies. And it obviously started post 9/11 with a dramatic focus on a much more preventative framework for dealing with illicit funds and illicit support to terrorist organizations. And in many ways, the early days of that cooperation was remedying or dealing with the pre-9/11 framework for how the Gulf was dealing with groups that were either tied to al-Qaeda or those that were supporting them. And It's no secret, and certainly been subject of lots of conferences and reports as to how we dealt with Saudi Arabia in those early days, dealing with the reality of deep pocket donors that were supportive of al-Qaeda or related groups prior to 9/11, charities and nonprofit organizations, which became a major subject of attention for the U.S. and our Gulf allies, and then putting in place the tools and strategies to allow us to actually prevent groups like al-Qaeda from gaining support and financing from the Gulf. That has been a story with many chapters to it, but the bottom line is that the U.S. has relied very heavily on that cooperation over time, one that has matured both in terms of how we deal with financial intelligence, which David can speak to better than anybody, what we have done in preventative terms to actually create systems that don't allow rogue capital to enter the system, at least theoretically, dealing with state sponsorship questions, making sure that there's clarity that states should not find or create mechanisms to support terrorist groups, and then trying to find ways of jointly acting against targets that we have found to be supporting terrorist groups. And so in the early days post 9/11, we had a number of these joint designations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That has followed in course. We've had continuous efforts in that same vein, including with Qatar in recent years, thanks to the work of the U.S. Treasury. And so there has been an evolution to actually focus on this in a fundamental way. And the one thing I would say, and this goes to Marcel's point at the introduction, these issues actually are more fundamental and more important now than ever before, not just because they form part of this political rift, but because the issues of how groups like al-Qaeda, groups like Daesh, other successor groups are actually raising funds, running war economies, and developing global networks is more critical now than ever before. There's been much in the literature about the folly of following the money or trying to deal with terrorist financing. And I think it's the exact opposite. I think it's more fundamental now to think through how it is that these types of groups gain support, are able to sustain themselves, and actually are able to build their networks and their global ambitions because of the financing that they have. That's why these issues are so important in the Gulf today. And in terms of the rift, it's clear to me that from an American standpoint, the rift is a burden and a barrier to cooperation. We have built our counter-terrorist financing and counterterrorism playbook around the idea that we need strong, cooperative allies on the ground, not just in a bilateral context, but in a regional context. And when we've had the most success, Steve, in this regard, and you know this well from your work, in particular in Yemen and elsewhere, where we've had the most success has been when like-minded allies are working together to gather intelligence and information, gather around a common strategy and mission, and then figuring out where there's a division of labor around the kinds of actions that need to be taken to deter, disrupt, and dismantle terrorist financing networks. To the extent that this rift doesn't allow that to happen, to the extent that it creates levels of mistrust, to the extent that it ruptures elements of information sharing, that is all not good from an American perspective. And I think anything we can do to try to repair the relationship, to try to focus on the mission of preventing terrorist financing is critical. There's lots of complications, of course, as to how you define terrorism, what we mean by terrorist financing, what we mean by state sponsorship. All of those issues are implicated by the rift. But I think fundamentally, from an American perspective, there is a need to have global, regional, and in the case of the Gulf states, GCC-level cooperation to deal with what is still a critical national and international security issue.
Thank you so much, Juan. And you've raised a couple of really interesting points we'll get back to, one of which certainly is the evolving financial model that some of the organizations are pursuing now, as well as a kind of collective GCC versus a bilateral cooperation and how that breaks down on the ground. So with that in mind, let me go over to David and ask you, David, for your view on this.
Sure. And thank you, Steve. Thank you, Marcel, for inviting me to be here. You know, as two former ambassadors who have done great work, I think it's worth at the outset noting how important it is in all of what we do in terrorist financing in particular that we have a strong and fully functioning and fully staffed State Department. Although this is an advertisement for the Treasury Department, we're all former Treasury officials. The work that we've been able to do in countering terrorist financing, not to mention many, many other areas, is enormously dependent on having a State Department that is out there, fully empowered and fully functioning. You can applaud. I think that's. So just a couple of quick thoughts, picking up on what Juan was saying. The effort to combat terrorist financing, I came to the Treasury Department in 2009 at a point where Juan and his team with Stuart Levy and others at Treasury had made enormous amount of progress in combating what was post 9/11 the principal problem, which was funding coming out of Saudi Arabia. Stuart famously said that if he could snap his fingers and end terrorist financing in Saudi Arabia, that would make all the difference, or something along those lines. That actually did not make him so popular with the ambassador in Saudi at the time. But by the time I got there in 2009, the Saudis had shifted quite significantly in their perspective on this issue and in their willingness and ability to work with the U.S. I then had the opportunities to try to build on those efforts. What we did in my tenure at Treasury, which spanned from 2009 to 15, was principally to work bilaterally. And I think this bears on the question of how important it is for there to be a unified GCC. By and large, with some very minor exceptions, all of the efforts that we undertook were bilateral, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the Bahrainis, with the Kuwaitis, and the Qataris. The sharing of intelligence information, which is critical to be able to identify who the terrorist financiers are, how they're raising their money, how they're moving their money, that also tended to be, I think exclusively is probably the right word there, exclusively bilateral. The only exception in my recollection was we made some efforts to enlist the Saudis to work with us in sort of a trilateral fashion with the Kuwaitis and the Qataris. I remember a couple of occasions in particular where we would be in Saudi speaking with Mohammed bin Nayef or Abu Ali and the folks who were sort of most important in the Interior Ministry there on the terrorist financing issue, to try to get them to essentially to put pressure with us on the Qataris and the Kuwaitis. That did not work so well, to not put too fine a point on it. And I think it was for a variety of reasons, but working in a trilateral fashion and working in the GCC more broadly was not something that we really tried to pursue. So the current situation in the Gulf right now, where you see, I think, a real potential for the GCC to splinter and for Qatar to go its way and the Saudis and the Emiratis their way, and with the other states sort of falling in line. I think that itself isn't the problem. I think the bigger problem is that you have Qatar, which had been making some progress in recent years in prosecuting terrorist financiers, in being a little bit more forward-leaning in its efforts, no longer feeling that it's in the club, inside the tent, and we lose a little bit of the sort of the moral suasion that comes from a combined effort of folks in the Gulf. And so that's really what I'm worried about in the current situation, is that the progress that we have seen with the Qataris in the last couple of years, which has been sort of hard-won, lots of efforts from Treasury and from State and others to move the Qataris along, that will begin to recede. And then I'll just make one final point. We can pick up on it later. The other thing that you all know happened recently in the Gulf that I think has significant implications for the future of counterterrorist financing is the switch in the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. So Mohammed bin Salman is now the Crown Prince. Mohammed bin Nayef has been ousted and also ousted from his position as the Minister of Interior. Mohammed bin Nayef was a stalwart partner of the United States in combating terrorist financing and really bringing Saudi Arabia to a point where it was doing, a quite good job in sort of across the board in combating terrorist financing. With him no longer in position in the Interior Ministry and no longer really in position in the government, we have lost, the United States has lost a key partner in this effort. And I think that is something that we need to watch very carefully because it was obviously not him by himself, but his position in that family, his position in that government was enormously important. On the other hand, Mohammed bin Salman, who doesn't have much of a track record in the terrorist financing arena, but does promise some modernization in Saudi Arabia, both economic and potentially the role of the clerical establishment and sort of the hardcore Wahhabi approach that you're all familiar with and that Saudi has been promulgating around the world. If he is successful in moderating that to some extent, that could have a beneficial impact in terrorist financing, not just in Saudi, but more broadly around the Arab world. So why don't I stop there and turn it back.
Great, thank you, David. And we will get back to this question, dynamics between states, maybe even within states, as our conversation proceeds. So, Kate, over to you, and you can assess for us the risks you see and opportunities, if there are any we haven't recognized.
Great. First, thank you to Ambassador Seche and the Arab Gulf states for hosting this panel and inviting me to join. I'm really honored to be up here with David and Juan, who have been great friends and mentors over many years. And I have to say, speaking after the two of them, I have to agree with a lot of what they said. But I think I'm going to find a couple of points to push on a little bit. I think that I agree with David that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have sought for years to kind of galvanize Qatari action against the terrorist financiers that were operating and continue to operate in Qatar. And that they've felt that there's a sense that the Qataris don't share the same threat perception as Saudi and the UAE. This is, in a way, this desire to pursue at different times what were multilateral attempts, whether the trilateral attempt that David mentioned or in other iterations, GCC joint efforts to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and have implementing mechanisms that went along with that, commitments that were made at the Camp David summits under the Obama administration to pursue multilateral joint efforts on counter-terrorist financing and Iranian malign activity in the region. These desires to bring the Gulf states together to try to get a more common threat perception associated with this activity. The repeated kind of inability to do that is reflected in the current rift, I think. And so that's how it's a part of this current rift as well. I think that it's important to note that Qatar has taken some action against terrorist financing, as David said as well, that they've taken action both against individuals. They've said UN-listed individuals, that their assets have been frozen, that there's travel bans in place, and that there have been some prosecutions, and also systematically. They've passed legislation to better regulate charities, to better regulate cyber activity, to criminalize certain types of fundraising or expression on social media. But that there are few signs of what specific actions they've taken under this legislation, or really a lot of details about what prosecutions or other law enforcement efforts there have been. And I think that's wherein lies an opportunity out of this rift and the role that that Saudi and the UAE, partially through the list that they published a couple weeks ago of I think it was 49 individuals and a number of entities. Herein, I think, lies an opportunity to continue to press Qatar to act against, first of all, the UN-designated individuals, to act to make sure they're no longer able to actively finance or facilitate in Qatar. I think one good thing would be that Qatar implemented or adopted a National Anti-Terrorism Committee a number of years ago, and it's placed within the Ministry of Interior, although it's an interagency body with representatives from various parts of the Qatari government, that this committee actually has the ability to designate terrorist financiers beyond what is at the UN, and that propagation of such a list by Qatar could help clarify some of the actions or some of the unclear signals that you see when you really dig into what, for example, the State Department has said. On one hand, that Qatar shut down a charity linked to al-Qaeda in Syria called Madad al-Sham in 2015, but then just this March, in a designation release, designation of actually a Kuwaiti individual who is a Nusra financier, that he was working with the individual who had run that Qatari charity. That was Saad al-Kabi who ran it. So despite the fact that the charity has been shut down, that individual continues to finance or to facilitate terrorist financing activity. So I think that there's a lot of unclear signals, and this is an opportunity to get some clarity on that.
Thank you very much, Kate. Let me, for a moment, then just kind of open the aperture a little bit more broadly and see if I can bring in a little bit of what Washington's thinking may be on this, and some other regional players, at least one other regional player that's on our minds as well. And Marcel noted in her introductory remarks that there is a lot of interest in the White House on counter-terrorist financing. And it was interesting the other day, the readout the White House issued after President Trump spoke to regional leaders on July 2nd. It was 5 sentences, and there were 2 mentions made of his really decisive focus on counter-terrorist financing. So it's clearly on his mind. My question is, we see the rhetoric, we hear the rhetoric. Do we detect any change in focus or policies on the ground that will distinguish this White House approach to counter-terrorist financing from, say, his predecessor or others? And to what extent do we see this targeting Iran, since Iran is so largely on the president's mind when he looks out at the Arab Gulf and beyond there in the Persian Gulf region? What about that? And do we see any shifts that we can detect at the moment, or is it still too early to know? And I'll invite Juan if you want to start with that.
Yeah, well, to me it's incredibly refreshing, because I remember I started back before 9/11 at the Treasury, where it was hard to get a seat at the table when talking about these issues. And to see both through the Bush administration, the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, the centrality of terrorist financing, in many ways, for those of us who are true believers as to the importance of these issues, it's very heartening. And the fact that it was such a centerpiece of the president's recent visit to Saudi Arabia, again, a testament to the importance of these themes and issues. I think first and foremost, the fact that this is such a principal issue from a regional perspective, that's perhaps not altogether different from the Obama administration or the Bush administration, but the fact that they've come out of the box so strong and full-throated around the issues of terrorist financing is significant, because it does put a marker down that this is going to be an issue that the administration, even if they don't have an articulated strategy yet, will have to contend with and grapple with over time in some complicated ways. The other thing that I think is interesting is that, and I've argued this for a long time, the focus on terrorist financing and illicit finance emerges very important, often thorny strategic and diplomatic issues, often things that have been sort of happening sub rosa but are forced to the surface because of the focus on terrorist financing. So how do we think of the Muslim Brotherhood? This is something we grappled with right after 9/11, something I mentioned in my book, by the way. Do we designate Karadali as a terrorist supporter because of his support to families of suicide bombers? The decision at the time with the Bush administration was we were going to look at the Muslim Brotherhood through a variety of lenses, and we were going to see where it was that they were actually supporting militant and terrorist causes. And where that occurred, we weren't going to turn a blind eye. We were going to go after it. Same goes with the question of Wahhabi proselytization and funding outside of the borders of the kingdom and in places like Central Asia, Southeast Asia. Those were questions that emerged not because we wanted to create tension with Saudi Arabia, but because we were looking at the landscape through the lens of terrorist financing. How do you think about charity in places of extreme need? Places like Gaza, places like Syria, places like East Africa, where we know terrorist groups have exploited those flows of funds, but where we also know we need charity to hit the ground and to help people in dire need. That's a fundamental question. It's a fundamental question now for how we think about Gulf support. How do we think about state sponsorship? What does that mean, and what does it mean from an Iranian perspective? So my hope, Steve, is that what you see emerging out of this, sort of the attention from the administration, is not just dealing with the tactical follow the money dimensions of, who's a terrorist financier, how do you arrest them? That's all very important. But how do you deal with some of these more fundamental issues? And I think with, again, the serious people you have on the inside, like H.R. McMaster, Secretary Mattis, Dina Powell, who's dealt with these issues before. We worked with her on some of these issues when she was at the State Department. I'm hopeful that means there's going to be a serious focus on these more fundamental issues which are tied to the question of terrorist financing.
Great, thank you, Juan. David or Kate, any thoughts on kind of the White House approach that you see shaping up at all? No obligation?
So I think that there's a signal in the rollout of this threat finance targeting center that was one of the key deliverables of the summit in Riyadh, that this is something that's a signal both of the importance to the Gulf states but also to this administration. And I think along with that, you've seen a pretty smooth transition in terms of the leadership of TFI, Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which is the division that David headed previously. So I think you have a team in the Treasury building that's ready to work with the White House that's ready to use these sorts of tools. But in a lot of fronts, where sanctions more broadly, not just counter-terrorist financing sanctions, can be used, it's important to have the policy framework in place as well, because these are tactical measures that need to be enacted in support of a broader policy. So I think when you look at how they might be applied in the context of Iran or Syria or other issues, there needs to be a focus on the policy framework as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just be somewhat less optimistic on this score. I think what we have seen is an embrace. I mean, we're a little bit of a victim of our own success. The administration came in, they saw terrorist financing, they saw sanctions as a broadly successful, easy-to-use tool, and they've embraced it. They understand it. The Terrorist Financing Tracking Center that was established with a lot of fanfare with the orb in Riyadh was a big move. But I think it is reason. I think there's reason to be concerned that what we have seen thus far with the administration is a embrace without the policy thought that goes behind it. So, I actually, not surprisingly, agree with both Kate and Juan on the idea that having a policy framework is critically important, and that addressing terrorist financing issues should force you to address things like the role of Wahhabism around the world. I think what we've seen is the administration giving a extraordinarily strong embrace of the Saudis, without a lot of nuance to how that embrace may implicate issues that are potentially undermining of our broader efforts. So I think it very much remains to be seen whether the administration's embrace of the terrorist financing issue is one that speaks to a sort of broader policy framework that's going to be effective, or is just grabbing onto something that was sort of low-hanging fruit.
Great.
Steve, can I just feed off of
By
that?
all means, go ahead, Juan. Yeah, sure.
David raises a really important point. There's real danger in this rift, obviously, and if it's persistent, if the scars are deep, if trust is sort of destroyed, is a real problem. There is a silver lining, though, and it relates to kind of how Washington relates to this issue, because to the extent that the Gulf countries are grappling with these questions on their own, or at least in this context. Now, this is messy and problematic, but to the extent that they are setting out sort of demands for themselves, because in putting out demands for the Qataris, there's a reflection back. And so there's serious questions not only for the Qataris to answer, but for the Kuwaitis that have been subject to Treasury actions when Dave and Kate were there, just as often as the Qataris were, or Qatari nationals were subject to these actions. Kuwaiti charities and institutions were problematic. Questions for Oman about its trade with Iran are now put in play. And so there's a dimension of silver lining here in the ownership of these issues, really for the first time by these countries. Because I think one of the critiques that we've consistently had, and I think it's been consistent in each administration, is most of the time, if it's not a tactical terrorist attack or immediate issue, on these themes, our Gulf allies have largely been reactive. They've waited for the U.S. to come with information. They've waited for an indictment to be sort of put out and the information shared. They've waited for the UN action. And their request has been, well, show us the information, then we will act. This may be a moment that we've all hoped for, which is at some point, countries around the world have to take ownership and have to try to not only discover these issues on their own, but deal with them locally and maybe even regionally in a proactive way. And I think the reflection back is really going to be a serious issue for all of the GCC countries, which is how are Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain all dealing with the reality that they have challenges still with respect to terrorist financing, illicit financing, their structures, their financial intelligence. That is going to be a serious question. They've now set the bar, not just for Qatar, but for themselves as well.
Could I just add to that? I think
I was
this
hoping
is.
you would. You'd make my job really easy if you just keep going.
I think this is an evolution that I saw during the time I spent in the Gulf, 2013 to 2015. And I'm going to speak more broadly than just terrorist financing, but I think there were so many dynamics that came into play at the same time. There was, on the one hand, I think a recognition of the value of the sanctions tool by Arab states, and the Arab League took action against Syria and had Arab League sanctions on Syria. There was also kind of the tail end of the global financial crisis and the impact that had on, I'd say in the UAE, I saw this in particular, where you had a kind of consolidation of foreign policy in the Abu Dhabi government that was more security-minded. The UAE had benefited a lot from inflows after the financial crisis, some as a result of the Arab Spring that kind of got its economy back running. But coupled with that, the security-mindedness and the amount of money flowing through the UAE was an awareness that, it was great to have it, but if you didn't know where it was coming from, it could be proceeds of narcotic trafficking, or it could be Islah financing, or it could be Hezbollah front companies working on procurement. More broadly in the region, the other dynamic that I think was really important is, and it's somewhat related, is de-risking. And what you saw, which is the idea that global banks, for a number of reasons after the financial crisis, because of large enforcement actions against them, were pulling back from some jurisdictions or lines of business that they saw perceived to be higher risk. You saw this in the Gulf hit SMEs, or small and medium enterprises, and exchange houses was another big one that's in a very important aspect of many Gulf financial systems because of remittance flows that flow through them. You saw the financial centers, and it's a very banked region. There's a little bit of competition between Doha and Dubai and others to be the regional financial center. Their need to maintain these international relationships, that they were putting upward pressure on regulators. At the same time, the security kind of mindedness of a number of governments were coming around to the value of this as well. And so I think that you do see, as Juan said, that there was a period, there's been a real kind of ownership of of illicit finance and the need to deal with it by these countries.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to try to draw in one other thread, and that's the FATF, if I may, and that's the Financial Action Task Force. And David, you've had a lot of experience at Treasury with FATF, and I'd like to ask you to describe for us, if you can, the extent of the cooperation that FATF has, the engagement with the Gulf states. And again, is it all bilateral? Is there a regional aspect to it, a GCC more broadly aspect to it that FATF can take advantage of, or how does it shape up and what does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who aren't deep in the weeds in the illicit finance world, I'll do a quick primer on FATF, and then Kate and Juan will correct me because they're more expert than I am. So the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, it's not actually an organization, it's a collection of countries that have come together to establish principles of how governments ought to regulate the financial sector and how financial institutions ought to behave in order to combat both money laundering and terrorist financing. And it works through a mutual evaluation process. So the members of the organization get together and say, next year we're going to evaluate the UAEs or Saudis or, the US actually went through a mutual evaluation recently. Their regulatory structure, their enforcement structure, their political structure against these recommendations that FATF has. It works essentially through embarrassment, and the FATF issues a report at the end of the evaluation and gives you a score on how well you've done. And if you don't do very well, the FATF will make recommendations on things you should do better, and can even recommend that, in extreme cases, that countermeasures be enacted by other countries around the world to protect themselves against the risk of illicit finance from that jurisdiction. It has been an enormously effective tool for raising around the world the quality of the effort against illicit finance, both money laundering and terrorist financing. In the Gulf, there are these regional FATF organizations, including one called MENA FATF, which is Middle East North Africa FATF, which is affiliated with the main FATF. They do mutual evaluations within the Gulf region, North Africa. It has, the Saudis, I don't know if you were in the Gulf at the time that the Saudi, I think it was before your time that the Saudi mutual evaluation was done. The Saudis went through one relatively recently. And it has the effect of spotlighting the weaknesses and encouraging improvements. One of the things that we have tried to do outside of the mutual evaluation episodes is to go to these countries and say, here's where your deficiencies are against the FATF recommendations, and you need to do better. So with Kuwait and Qatar in particular, part of what we used to do at Treasury, I'm sure they're still doing it at Treasury, is to go to the regulators in these jurisdictions and say, here's where you're deficient, and you need to up your game. That has, it has had middling success, I would say, in getting particularly the Kuwaitis and the Qataris to get better. I mean, in just one slight digression here. So in 2014. After a lot of internal debate, I gave a speech on terrorist financing where we called out the Qataris and the Kuwaitis as being permissive jurisdictions for terrorist financing. That was done in part out of a judgment that our private engagement with those countries, and private engagement including saying, here's how you're not measuring up against the FATF standards, had not achieved what we were trying to achieve, and calling them out publicly, sort of outside of the normal FATF mutual evaluation process, but calling them out publicly in a more of a bilateral fashion, but a public fashion, would spur them to act, because doing it privately had sort of not achieved what we were trying to achieve. Hard to know exactly what that exactly accomplished, other than me not being welcome there. they would welcome me. It was always a little frosty though after that. But that's another way that we use the FATF recommendations as a way to try to encourage better efforts.
Great. Juan, please.
Steve, can I add to that? I was fortunate enough to lead our delegation at the inauguration of the MENA FATF, the Middle East North Africa FATF, the regional body that David mentioned. It may have been one of the last times we had talked to the Syrians directly, actually, there in Bahrain. But I think FATF's been enormously successful because you've had a group of like-minded jurisdictions, whether it's in FATF proper or in these regional bodies, that have been committed to, at least in theory, applying these laws and regulations and recommendations, and then being willing to be submitted to these evaluations by foreign experts. Countries big and small, U.S. all the way to Macau, right, are being evaluated. And to David's point, with enormous impact. It's the shaming dimension, but it's also the market effects. To Kate's point about de-risking, the private sector very much looks at these evaluations and assessments to understand the level of integrity within these jurisdictions. How good are they at dealing with money laundering? How serious are they dealing with terrorist financing? Do they have institutions in place to actually handle these issues and these risks? It's a process that's actually been enormously effective, and it gets the attention of governments, which is, to David's point, as to why it's been a tool of choice for the U.S. government to be able to push governments to improve. It's also why FATF has looked at countries like North Korea and Iran and put them on kind of, in essence, a blacklist for deficiencies in their AML, anti-money laundering, and terrorist financing systems. And it's why those countries, and Iran in particular, is so dead set on getting off that list and dealing with what are the both market-based and jurisdictional countermeasures against the country and against their reintegration into the financial system until they take these steps. A final note on FATF, because I think it's going to grow more important, not less, in the future, and it's important for the audience to understand. FATF has started a new process of evaluations, of assessments around this question of effectiveness. So the assessments in the past have largely been around, can you show me that you have a financial intelligence unit in place? Do you have a law against terrorist financing? Can you show me that the banks know how to file suspicious activity reports? You know, these kinds of fundamentals of the system. And we've graduated now to a point where the FATF is asking a core question of, that's good, you have to have those things in place, but is your system actually working? Is it actually preventing illicit capital from entering the system? Do your institutions work? That's leading to a lot of soul searching in countries. It's leading to a lot of improvements in a rapid way for those countries that are now being subject to this assessment. And it's also leading to more enforcement actions. And so you're seeing more countries on their own, not prompted by the US, but on their own, begin to fine banks, hold financial institutions accountable, bring prosecutions, precisely to demonstrate to the international community that their system can work, it does work, and here's the evidence. So that's a very important process that I think is worth keeping in mind. And again, the Gulf countries have submitted to these principles and these rules that are global principles, both through the MENA FATF and through the FATF process itself.
Great. Thank you, Juan.
More than you ever wanted to know about FATF.
Other than it's a terrible acronym. I want to turn to Kate for a minute because I want to take advantage of your experience in the field as a financial attaché, and we're talking about U.S. cooperation in the Gulf with the Gulf states, and you were there. You're on the ground. Can you describe for us how extensive is the network of U.S. engagement? How many countries are we there? Are you covering when you were out there? Are you all over the Gulf? I mean, are you a one-woman band who has to go from country to country and figure out what these individuals what they're going to be doing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a great question because I think what we do at the Treasury, not just as an attaché, but when, as Juan and David as senior officials, the kind of sanctions diplomacy and engagement on a technical level with our counterparts in ministries of finance and central banks is kind of unknown. But publicized by Juan's wonderful book on that focused a lot on that issue. So as the Treasury Department has a very small core of attachés, it's I think usually about 10 to 12 in the world. So it's very small, and where the attachés are placed is usually determined by what the priorities are. They're not necessarily seen as permanent positions. So as priorities shift, resources will be shifted because it's so small and zero sum. But the attaché program in the Gulf was set up, I believe, in 2008. The first attaché was sent out and was in Abu Dhabi with a deputy in Riyadh shortly after. It was then augmented, I think, around 2010. The position in Riyadh was made as a full attaché, and the position in Abu Dhabi took on covering Kuwait and Qatar as well. And then in 2013, which was when I arrived, I was responsible for the GCC minus Saudi, and with a deputy in Abu Dhabi. When I left, there was an attaché placed in Doha with responsibility for Qatar and Kuwait, which was something that I pushed for since. A lot of the value of having someone forward deployed is the ability to be available and follow up. And it was, a lot of travel over a couple of years, even though those are short flights. And the one to Doha I always liked because you land technically before you take off, coming from Abu Dhabi, since it's a 45-minute flight. But nonetheless, the value in having someone there a lot of times is the ability to be available and to develop, rapport with the counterparts and to concentrate on very technical issues. And I would say that throughout the Gulf, we've had very good relationships with our counterparts in finance ministries and in central banks, and can really connect on those technical levels. The attachés work on policy matters. They work on sanctions implementation, promoting best practices and standards such as the FATF standards. In the Gulf, there's a little bit of technical assistance involved as well, although that's done more so elsewhere, where you have lower resource countries, would be where the Treasury would really commit more resources to technical assistance. The idea being higher resources countries can find technical assistance through commercial means or on their own. But it's an important job, I think, in terms of having that ongoing engagement and being able to facilitate the higher level visits as well. I saw David a lot when I was out in the Gulf, and needed to know who he should meet with and prepare all the sides. But I think it's been something that's facilitated, as was mentioned before, the number of joint designations that have been done over the years, which I think is a very clear demonstration when they happen of where interests, are. It's a very good public demonstration of how we can find where our interests coincide and work together. But there's a lot more examples that are never made public, because I think one thing is, you can't necessarily judge the effectiveness of counter-terrorist financing by designations. There's a lot of reasons designations don't happen, and a lot of that is, one of those is because we're able to work quietly, or the Treasury Department, the government is able to work quietly with counterparts to have counterparts take actions that would disrupt whatever activity it is that we want to see disrupted.
And one of the reasons I asked the question is there was at one point in this conversation, as the GCC imbroglio has revealed itself, that I think the State Department might have suggested that Treasury embed officials within the Qatari Central Bank or the Finance Ministry to get, ensure greater visibility into financial transactions. Does that seem like it seems like a great idea to me, but is there any fly in the ointment I'm not looking at that would seem to suggest to you it's not workable or it's something we should really not consider?
Well, I think that, as I said, first of all, there's already a Treasury presence on the ground there. And I guess I would say I'm not sure it's necessary to have someone in the Central Bank of Qatar. I think that one of the important things is that countering terrorist financing or other illicit finance is an all-of-government effort, because the vulnerabilities aren't exclusively in the financial sector. In fact, the State Department has said in their reports on Qatar that one of the problematic things is the ability of individuals to bypass the formal financial sector, and so it involves working with Ministry of Interior, Customs, often border control, various elements to identify. A lot of times, one of the big challenges in kind of operationalizing counter-terrorist financing is taking what is an intelligence lead and making it susceptible, especially if it's in, if it's a domestic issue, into a law enforcement action. And so that is not, exclusively or primarily a central bank responsibility. But what the central bank does when it houses the financial intelligence unit, as it does in Qatar, is a very important element of it, because it's getting the financial intelligence unit gets information from banks about suspicious activities, and that can be very important lead information in that whole process. So there's a role, but I don't think it's the most important place, and perhaps in Qatar not where that person needs to be, but there is already a person on the ground.
Great. I want to go back now to something that Juan alluded to earlier on, and that's kind of the evolving financial model that some of the terrorist organizations around the world, certainly in the Middle East and Syria with Daesh and ISIL, if you will, have been using, because they've been self-financing for a long time, and they've been using smuggling of oil and oil products and antiquities and ransom from kidnappings as a way to generate their own money. But now that seems to be drying up. They no longer hold territory. This is more complicated, and they're looking externally, I suspect, for more financing. How big a threat is that now to Arab Gulf states to avoid becoming the conduit where they will look to most usefully?
Steve, it's a great question, because one of the dangers, in particular of the Syrian conflict, is that you have a resurrection of the external sources of funding for internal causes and proxy wars. And the use of charities, which was such a focus post 9/11, was largely kind of managed and handled, has now been resurrected. The idea of deep pocket donors willing to support different causes because they're more effective, for example, fighting forces against Assad, that's a problem. But you're absolutely right. The terrorist and militant groups that we worry about, the ones that have regional and global aspirations, have accordion-like financial models, right? They'll take whatever opportunities they're given. And in the 90s, you had a much more hierarchical, donor-based, externally based driven financing model for Al-Qaeda. It then used that to help build franchises and to support them. What you've had in the post 9/11 era, given the pressure put on these organizations, given the fracturing and metastasizing of the movement, has been a much more localized set of economies and industries that the terrorist groups have taken advantage of. So Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has made a fortune in an industry out of kidnap for ransom, right? Something David talked a lot about when he was at Treasury. Al-Shabaab in East Africa has run a whole economy out of exporting charcoal and importing sugar, a trade-based money laundering system. It's why the UN sanctions there's sanctions on the export of coal out of East Africa. That's why. They've always used the remittances and taxes off of their checkpoints and other things to their advantage. And of course, Daesh has used its access to oil, antiquities, massive populations, urban environments to their advantage to tax, extort, actually run economies, not to mention the whole oil industry from production to delivery. So these organizations will take whatever opportunities we give them in terms of resources and space. And I think one of the dangers, to your point, Steve, is as that space shrinks, they're going to need and want other sources. And so that will look a lot like things that we've seen in the past. There's going to be elements of criminality attached to it. There's going to be smuggling still of oil in the case of Middle East-based organizations. They're going to use resources that are at their command. You've seen this with other terrorist groups, non-Islamic extremist groups like the Naxalites in India. They use mining interest, right, to their advantage. You've seen this with the FARC using the drug trade in the past. And so these are groups that are innovative. They've grown more global, more sophisticated, and to the extent that they have sophisticated support networks, they're able to adapt. And that's why constricting their support networks becomes so important. Constricting their ability to reach across borders, cutting off their access to capital and to resources is critical. And again, as I said at the start, it's why these issues are even more important now than ever, because as we try to constrict Daesh, you don't want the son of Daesh to have access to new resources, whether it's from external donors or local sources. That's why you need the Gulf countries to be focused on these issues. We need our allies around the world to be on side in terms of disrupting terrorist financing.
David?
Yeah. again, I agree with Juan. I mean, just in ISIS in particular, it grew out of AQI. AQI, its financing model was the traditional Al-Qaeda financing model of raising money from donors. When ISIL grew, took over territory, it had a easier way of raising funds, which was to extort the population that it had taken over, and to sell oil through smuggling routes that had been in existence previously. But as their territory is now shrinking, their control over population is being lost. I think every reason to expect that it's going to return to what had worked in the past, which is a donor-financed approach, particularly because when it's no longer governing vast amount of territory, it needs less money in order to fund its particular terrorist activity. The one other point I would make is that when people talk about terrorist financing, they often focus in on a very sort of narrow understanding of what terrorist financing is, which is the sort of traditional donor model where you raise money, you put it into the bank, and then you move it. We've done, working with partners around the world, a pretty good job at stymieing that approach, and this gets back a little bit to the FATF discussion. But sort of regardless of the means by which money is raised, whether it's from donors, whether it's from state sponsors, whether it's from extortion, selling ivory, whatever it is, there are common elements in a terrorist organization's use of money that we need to sort of keep focus on and continue to attack. And that's that they need to move that money, they need to store that money, they need to spend that money in order to be effective. And so it sort of does not matter a heck of a lot how the money is raised. Those sort of three elements are common across the landscape. And so making sure they can't use the formal financial system makes a difference regardless of how the money is raised. Making sure that they can't move money in from a bank-to-bank transfer, and forcing them to use hawalas, forcing them to think about using virtual currencies, forcing them out of what the modern world has developed as a super efficient way to store and move money is going to be effective regardless of the model that the terrorist organization uses to raise its funds.
Great. I think at this point I'm going to open up the conversation to folks out here who've been very patient. As I do, let me please ask you to identify yourself, if you would, and also to keep your questions or comments as succinct as possible so we can accommodate as many people as possible. And we have microphones. Claire has one. Aman has one. I'll go to Barbara, and I'll go to David.
Thank you very much. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Very, very, very interesting conversation. I wanted to ask all three of you, is Qatar's record on these issues that much worse than others in the GCC? David, you mentioned Kuwait as having been a problem in the past, and do you think that is really the main reason that we're seeing this rift in the GCC? Thank you.
So I think the answer is no and no. It's not, Qatar is not that much worse than Kuwait. I think it's markedly worse than others in the Gulf, but the distinction between Qatar and Kuwait is, I think, real but not that great. And I think that the broader issue that is currently embroiling the Gulf is not fundamentally about terrorist financing. I think it's much more about the support of the, and that's why the focus is on Qatar and not Kuwait. It's the support coming out of the Qataris for groups and individuals that challenge the stability of the the governing entities in the UAE, in Saudi, in Bahrain, and in Egypt. There is, to be sure, a legitimate concern with terrorist financing in Qatar. And I'm not saying it's pretext, but it is not the full text of what's going on in the Gulf right now.
Okay, thank you. David, raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. And then over here.
David Weinberg, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So I wanted to ask about another dimension of Gulf states and the terror finance issue, which is kidnapping for ransom, something that I think all of you have worked on, but David, you've been very public about. My understanding is that there's a report under the State Authorization Act of 2017 that this administration is late on producing for Congress, which would be a public report on which countries in the last year the U.S. government knows provided ransom to terrorist groups. There have been a number of press reports citing either government officials or private sources alleging that Qatar has paid numerous ransoms to terrorist groups. Qatar, of course, denies doing so. I was wondering if any of you are in a position, A, to either give Qatar a clean bill of health or to speak at all about whether there's any substance to these allegations.
So, no, I'm happy to have you answer that question. No, but so I can't give them a clean bill of health, but that's only because I'm not up on the on what would be probably something I couldn't talk about if I was up on it. But you know, to go to your broader question, there's no question that there are countries that have paid ransoms to free their citizens who have been kidnapped. It is the longstanding policy of the United States not to pay ransom. The U.S. government will not pay ransom to free hostages. We went through in the Obama administration a very detailed, careful, and frankly heart-rending process of trying to reconcile that policy, which is a policy that long predated the Obama administration, with the fact that there are Americans who are held around the world who we want to get out. And at the end of the day, there's more nuance in this, but the resolution was that we were going to do everything in our power to assist in freeing hostages short of paying ransom, on the theory that you pay ransom, it's just going to encourage the terrorist organizations to take more hostages and demand more ransoms, and it is ultimately to the detriment of Americans everywhere. The second piece of that is that we work with other countries around the world to adopt a similar policy, and it's pretty much right now just the UK that has a similar policy. There was a G8 communique from a couple years ago trying to spur others to adopt a similar approach. It's a terribly difficult issue, but I think the policy is sound, and the report that that apparently is due, calling out countries that pay ransom, I think is a worthwhile step.
We got a question here in the second row. I guess you're up again, Claire.
Hi, Nafisa Saeed from Bloomberg News. You talked about, a couple of you talked about how keeping this rift going is not in the interest of the U.S. long term when it comes to terror financing. I'm just wondering, kind of broadly right now, what you've been hearing about what role Secretary Tillerson or Secretary Mattis have been having in Washington with Gulf diplomats, maybe any dialogue between Saudis and others, and also if you think military escalation is just would be too far, if that would even be on the table still, you think, from the perspective of these GCC countries?
Maybe I can take this one. I don't see, certainly the rhetoric seems to suggest that all the parties involved don't want to escalate this to the point where we're talking about military action. I think that's obviously in everyone's best interest. And I think if there were any suggestions that we were seeing signals of that or moving toward that, you'd have a much heavier U.S. hand to calm the waters, I think just by necessity. And frankly, by virtue of the fact that we've got troops on both sides of and interests militarily on all sides of this. So I don't see it going that way, and I don't think it's in anybody's interests, including the parties who feel so aggrieved on both sides of this equation to move toward military escalation. In terms of the U.S. line, you know, one of the criticisms you've heard is there have been mixed messages coming out of Washington. You've had the State Department calling for a calming of the waters, resolution calmly. What seems to be from the White House a firmer embrace of the Saudis and that side, and a bit more of a tougher stance. And so I think there's been a danger of mixed signals coming out of Washington, and I think it behooves us to have not only sort of a common voice on this, but the role of peacemaker, not because we want to be the moral giants here, although I think we do, but because we've got real fundamental interests at play, short and long term, and that means having the countries resolve these issues. And frankly, if we're smart about it, as I said earlier, making this about ownership of these issues long term by these countries. If the countries in the region are serious about dealing with terrorist financing, there's a number of fundamental things that they should be doing. If they're serious about curtailing trade with Iran that's deemed to be dangerous or risky and enabling of the IRGC, then there are things that need to be doing. If we're worried about payment of ransom to terrorist groups that continues to fuel their operations, then there's a lot that can be done with all of the countries. And so I think if we were smart about this, we would not only be speaking with a unified voice, but we would be taking proactive measures to not only resolve these issues, but think forward about how does this actually improve things that are inherent in our own national security interests. That's what I hope's happening. I don't know if that's happening, but I think certainly there's a lot of discussions here in Washington around these issues, lots of attention by all the Gulf partners, and certainly I'm sure Marcel and the Institute here is sort of a fulcrum of a lot of these discussions, precisely because there's so much question and interest as to what Washington will do and say.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question right here, and then we'll go to Joyce, and we'll go here to you, sir.
Ahmad from Nusak. So when someone says, for example, Qatar finances terrorism, there is no distinction made between the governments and individuals doing this financing activity. So how can such organizations make this distinction, and how can you hold governments accountable or responsible for the actions of individuals or its citizens in that sense?
David, you want to?
Yeah, so at one level, the distinction is important to make between state sponsorship and private sponsorship of terrorist activity. Those are two different problems, and it's important to draw the distinction between them. That being said, so set aside state sponsorship for the time being. I think governments have a responsibility to govern their population, their citizens and those who reside in their country. And that doesn't mean that the government is responsible for everybody at every moment of the day, but at the same time, if there is a conscious decision taken by a government to be lax in the application of existing laws, or not to enact laws that criminalize or prohibit behavior that is contrary to international norms, that I think is fairly the criticisms fairly put at the feet of the government in that situation as being enabling and permitting terrorist financing from occurring, even if the government itself isn't the source of the money. They are allowing that activity to occur. That has historically been the problem in Qatar. It's historically been the problem in Kuwait. I think, as we've mentioned, there's been progress in both jurisdictions, in both in enacting laws and enforcing laws, so that they are better than they had been historically. But at the same time, I think there's no question that there's more progress that could be made.
Steve, please. Can I just touch on this? Because I think it's a critical question, and there's two dimensions to it. One is, how do you define the terrorist group itself, right? So this is where the question of Muslim Brotherhood is injected into the current debate, and it's an important question. But then, to David's point, it's a whole spectrum of support. And the challenge here is we've often had a binary to say there's either state sponsorship or there isn't. And there really is quite a bit of gradation here, right? There's, on one end, individuals that are just doing things on their own and the government's trying to prosecute it. Certainly the U.S. has had cases of individuals supporting terrorism. We prosecute them, right? So you've got that end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is states that actually have in their budget the support of terrorist groups, like Iran, right? It's a line item in their budget. So there's no question about it. They declare it. The receiving entities talk about it. So there's that. Then there's everything in between. There's everything from incompetence to willful blindness to benign neglect to soft support, right? So I think we've got to be careful in the debate to not create sort of a binary and not allow actors to kind of fall behind the shield of sort of the vagaries of these definitions and the spectrum, because it's very important to have clear discussions about what we're talking about. Who is it that we're talking about that's a terrorist? Why are we doing this? And to what extent can the government actually affect this? And again, this issue of spectrum is really important because it's often seen as a binary question to the point of your question, but it's often more complicated than that.
Okay. David?
Can I just,
Yeah, of
and
course.
just to follow on that thought, what part of the spectrum here, as Juan alluded to, is who's a terrorist organization? And sort of to get a little bit to the question that Barbara was asking earlier about what's motivating what's happening in the Gulf right now, clearly the Qataris view the Muslim Brotherhood as a legitimate political actor in the Gulf and elsewhere. The Emiratis do not. Now, and I think the Emiratis would say that the distance between Muslim Brotherhood and terrorist is vanishingly thin. The Qataris clearly don't take that view. So if you have just hypothetically state sponsorship of the Muslim Brotherhood, you could understand a state saying, well, yeah, we're supporting a political organization, we're not supporting a terrorist group. Others may disagree, and so as we look at what's happening in the Gulf right now, another one of the dimensions that's really important to bear in mind is that this is, I think, fundamentally a question about sort of the role of political Islam and how you define, what is a legitimate political organization from what is a wolf in sheep's clothing terrorist organization portraying itself as a political organization, but not.
Claire, over here in the front row, please.
Yes, hi, thanks, Steve. Great panel. I actually have two questions. The first on the list that Katherine brought up, the 49 individuals and entities that were designated by the 4 Arab states. Do you see it overlapping with lists that you might have seen or names that you might have seen while you were at Treasury? And then, some say actually that it's better for the US for designated terrorists, for example, like Khalid Mash'al or others, to be in Doha, to be, playing ping pong in Doha rather than making trouble in Beirut or somewhere else. How do you respond to that argument?
I'll take the first one. So I think on the list, Joyce, to answer that question first, there is some overlap, a fair amount of overlap with U.S. designated individuals and UN designated. I think that there's at least 6 UN designated individuals on that list. There are, however, many individuals on that list who are not designated by the U.S. or the UN. The UAE and Saudi both have their separate lists as well, and there's organizations on their list that aren't designated by the U.S. I think that countries have the ability, and if not the requirement under the FATF standards, to develop the capability to have these sorts of lists so they can identify and send clear messages to their domestic population about who it is off limits to deal with in terms of financial transactions and things of the sort. So I think, as I said earlier, that's something that that Qatar can do. They could develop their own list to provide some clarity on who they see as fitting, that definition within their own jurisdiction. And one of the things that these lists do in a domestic sense is, it could also facilitate further action from a law enforcement perspective, because you can say, we said this was prohibited and you did it. The UN level designations, member states have obligations to implement travel bans and freeze funds associated with those. So I think, I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Michelle playing
Playground.
We leave him in the rec room, or do we move?
Do you want to?
I'm happy to help.
Okay.
It's a really important question because the challenge for Qatar is it's not only Khalid Mashal, right? It's the Taliban office. It's UN designated individuals. So Doha, through that lens, begins to look like a playground for international scofflaws and terrorists, right? But it raises an interesting question. Is it better to have individuals in a place where you can perhaps control them, monitor them, communicate with them, have a channel to those organizations if you do desire to have that communication? That's a really important question. Something I've thought about is if the Qataris are doing this, and they're doing this in a way that is advantageous to the international community. There's kind of an understanding that, look, we want a place where maybe there's a negotiation happening with the Taliban, and we want it to happen in a safe place like Doha. Maybe that's okay, but maybe that shouldn't be just a Qatari decision, or maybe it should be a much more open decision made with its neighbors as well as other key partners like the Afghan government. And so I think it's an important question, but one that Qatar shouldn't be necessarily trying to resolve on its own. This is actually a regional and international set of issues as to how we want to deal with these groups, and frankly, how you want to deal with things like funding for humanitarian purposes into places like Gaza, which we want, right? We want people not to starve. We want people to have homes. We want people to have medical treatment. Okay, if that's the case, what does that mean? And I think, maybe one of the constructive things that comes out of this rift is a more collective sense of how do we solve some of these hard problems. And maybe Doha ultimately looks a lot like it does now, but it's with international approval and with other checks and balances it makes it much more comfortable for its neighbors. Maybe not, but I'm always searching for a constructive way forward, and I think that's one way of looking at it.
Right. If Khalid Mashal was just playing ping pong in Doha, it'd be fine. Right. The Qataris portray themselves as sort of the Switzerland of the Gulf. That's what they want to be, which is an interesting model, particularly in the illicit finance world, because for a long time, Switzerland was the playground for for all manner of people who had illicit funds in bank accounts there. And I mean, sort of to Juan's point, the international community got together and said, enough. We're not going to let you have numbered accounts. We're not going to let you, you have an important role, Switzerland, as being neutral, being a place, being a financial center, but not to the expense of the rest of the world's efforts to combat illicit finance. And I think that exact same model could be applied in a slightly different context, but the same model with Doha.
Yes, Imad El Hadi. I'm not affiliated with any organization. I have a question for Mr. Cohen and for Mr. Zarate. You talked earlier about the Bush administration looking at the Muslim Brotherhood through different lenses. Was that, or was there any lens among these that it is a worldwide consortium of businesses and companies and organizations that channeling money everywhere, including Qatar and Turkey? And for Mr. Cohen, the question about, you said earlier that in the last 2 years there has been a good work done with Qatar in combating financing terrorism. Could you expand on this? What kind of good work? given the fact that Qatar is the only Arab country that never, ever suffered a terrorist attack?
Yes, it's a great question. I think, again, as we looked at the world through the lens of illicit financing, terrorist financing, you begin to see ties and networks that you wouldn't otherwise see in relationships. And I think in looking at the Muslim Brotherhood, there was a concern, there is a concern, I think, though I don't sit in the government anymore, of course, with the business, financial, and even political ties of the entire organization and the networks that are attached to it, and the key nodes and the national manifestations of the group as a result. And so we very much were focused on that. And in fact, a couple of the designations which were controversial post 9/11 included individuals who were supporting al-Qaeda, who were designated, who were also Muslim Brotherhood members, who sat in Switzerland, and who were subject to international sanctions as a result. And so the answer to your question is yes, we worried about it. The approach was to not try to isolate the entirety of the organization with all of its manifestations, but to identify where there were problematic connections and a nexus to material support to terrorism, not to attack the group for ideological reasons, and not to designate all of their members under terrorist provisions. That was a decision of the Bush administration. I think it followed in the Obama administration, and it takes the premise is not all elements of the Muslim Brotherhood are alike. Not all should be handled in the same way with the same tools, and I think that creates both nuance and complication in the current debate.
Yeah, I'll start off and I'm going to ask Kate to add on here. So my understanding is in the last several years, Qatar has prosecuted a few individuals for terrorist financing and has, sort of to Juan's effectiveness point, become more effective in implementing the laws and regulations they have in place to combat terrorist financing. There's still a way to go. I think there are still people in Doha who are there with the awareness of the Qatari government. Just to do a brief digression here, after that March 2014 speech they gave calling out Qatar and Kuwait for being permissive jurisdictions for terrorist financing, I did travel to Qatar and Kuwait on several occasions and met with the security services and others, and to encourage them to improve their performance. It was abundantly clear to me that they knew exactly who was raising funds in their jurisdictions, where they were, what they were doing, how they were doing it, how the money was being moved, and nonetheless were not, by and large, prepared to do anything about it. So although there has been progress, and so that predates the last 2 years, that I've been gone from Treasury for longer than that. So there has been some progress that was made in the last 2 years in going after the sort of low-hanging fruit that was available to them in Qatar and Kuwait as well. I think there remains more progress, more fruit that could be harvested.
So I could just add a little bit on the specifics, even though there's not that many specifics. I think this is one of the things, what we know about what Qatar has done in the last couple of years has come primarily from U.S. government reports of it. So Qatar itself hasn't, the prosecutions that various U.S. officials have said have been pursued using kind of squishy language that leaves it not quite clear, even though there's been some clarity in recent weeks. The Qataris aren't publicizing those in any way. So that's been one of the problems. Is it's not clear if this is a reflection of an incomplete commitment to doing it. I think, or if there's just concerns given small societies. That's what I've heard before about publicizing this, or security concerns because there's information that's used that's sensitive, things like that. But there has not been a lot of public information. What we've learned in the last couple of weeks is that there are 5 individuals that have been prosecuted. One of them was prosecuted not in Qatar but in Bahrain. That's Khalifa al-Subai, who was convicted by a Bahraini court of terrorist financing in 2008 and served a very brief term in Qatar. And then there were 4 other individuals. None of them, 2 were convicted, or 1 was convicted. Essentially, there were a couple of convictions, a couple of acquittals, but ultimately none of them are imprisoned. And the concern there is although Qatar says they're under extensive supervision, that we've seen before, that there has been recidivism amongst these individuals. It's been an ongoing issue. But I think that the kind of takeaway is that these actions have come under significant pressure from the U.S. And what the signal, I think, is been, an emerging theme here is kind of ownership of these issues rather than responding to significant pressure from the U.S. That what I think is in the U.S. interest is to see Qatar act in a way that sends a clear message that they're acting of their own volition to take care of what the U.S. has seen as something that's problematic.
Well, we're approaching the end of our allotted time, so I'll just invite each of our guests, if you have any final closing thoughts you'd like to share with our guests, you're welcome to do so. Again, no obligation. We can move on from here.
Well, first of all, let me thank our hosts. Again, this is a great conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope you all did as well. I'll just come back to a theme that I started with, which is the issues of terrorist financing, I think, will continue to be strategically relevant. It's going to play out in the context of the rift in the Gulf, but it's going to continue to be a fundamental issue when you look at U.S. policy in the Middle East. How we think about definition of terrorism and terrorist groups, how we deal with the underlying ideologies that animate terrorist organizations, what happens post-Daesh, because I think we are going to see the defeat of Daesh on the battlefield, but that's not the end of the story. And how this then gets resolved in the context of this rift becomes critical. But I think the U.S. has a role to play, obviously a leading role to play, in not only resolving these issues currently, but setting a strategy and a course for the international community as to how to deal with more and more complicated issues as terrorism evolves over time. And I think that's the enduring challenge for the counterterrorism community and certainly for this administration. So thank you for your time.
So I'll just also echo Juan's thanks for organizing this and for a really useful conversation. I will just pull the lens way back just for a second and sort of away from terrorist financing, which is a hugely important issue, one that we need to continue to work on. But I think we need to recognize 2 fundamental facts. One is that what is the underlying causes of instability and terrorist activity is something that we need to address, not just in the terrorist financing issue, which fuels it, but there are issues in the Middle East and elsewhere that require long-term, serious strategy. We can't ignore that part of the world. We can't cut it off. We can't bomb it into submission. We need to figure out a way to address those issues. And the second is that there's, I think, in some respects, an increasingly weakening link between terrorist financing and terrorist acts. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that even as we do a better job, and hopefully we will continue to do a better job in cutting off financing, there is a tail to terrorist organizations' capacity to conduct terrorist attacks, and there's also, I think, an increasing movement towards not the centralized directed attack, but to the inspired attack, and we as a country need to recognize that and be resilient in the face of what is, as everybody who's been in this business has said time and again, the virtual certainty that we're going to face additional attacks of some form. We need to be strong as a country We need to not overreact. We need to be sensible in how we address this problem. But as we think about terrorism, I think those two poles that we're both, there's work to be done in the long term, and there's sort of resilience and strength and sobriety in how we address what is going to be a problem for us going forward for a long time is critically important.
I think David just introduced ideas that we could spend another hour and a half discussing, and some very interesting and important things. But I think I would echo what David and Juan said, and just say that I think that the need to follow the money is kind of more acute than ever because of the instability that David mentioned and the adaptability we see of terrorist organizations to exploit weak and ungoverned areas to fund themselves, but also because of the role of financial intelligence can play when you're talking about even attacks that aren't expensive, even attacks that are small cells or directed at least in any way. Mapping out relationships between actors can be very important. But I think getting back to the question of instability and post-ISIS, it makes me think that it's a question of governance, and that I think where something that we've come to understand better in, since 9/11 is how an important part of that is regulation of the financial sector and partnering between those regulators and law enforcement and intelligence services to be able to have, when you have especially post-conflict areas, have them that they can attract the investment and to help with development, but also keep the bad actors out of that realm. And I think that's going to be, if we can try to look beyond this, the trend right now of exploitation of these ungoverned spaces, that's where we need to be thinking in the future. And thank you again to the Arab Gulf states for hosting this panel.
Well, you all have been very kind in thanking us. Now it's really our turn to thank you, and we really do. Kate Bauer, David Cohen, and Juan Zarate, thank you so very much, and we hope you'll come back.